This program was made possible by a grant from S.R. Foxley and Q, and by the generous support of viewers like you. If you wish to join them in pledging to this channel, please find a link to the Prophet of Zod Patreon below. Greetings! I apologize for having skipped so many videos recently, but a couple weeks of illness and a short vacation kinda threw me off schedule. It was all temporary though, and we should now be seeing weekly videos coming out a lot more consistently. Today I'm going to be responding to a video called Abusing the God of the Gaps Fallacy. It was made by an apologetic YouTuber named Inspiring Philosophy, which it turns out is a very ironic name, and as you might have guessed by the title, the whole thing is just a long, tedious exercise in splitting. Well, instead of telling you, I think I'll show you. See, what this video does is repeatedly take hairs, like this one, and makes a painstaking yet pointless effort to split them right down the... Ow, mother! Now first off, I want to thank Grande Geule 007 for suggesting this video. If the rest of you ever have suggestions for videos I can respond to, always feel free to grab my attention, on Twitter ideally, and I'll see if I can get to it. But with that, let's get this bullshit rolling.
It seems a common reply to the arguments from natural theology is to cry God of the gaps.
Okay, I'm sorry to jump in so early, and I don't want to be nitpicky, but come on. Why crying God of the gaps? It always sounds amateur and sets off red flags when a person characterizes the other side as crying their argument. There's no useful reason for this wording, and when it's applied to a dispassionately analytical practice like pointing out a God of the gaps fallacy, I have every reason to suspect it was just kind of tossed in as a childish low blow. I guess maybe the point is to insinuate that skeptics just shout out the phrase as a thoughtless knee-jerk reaction? Or I guess maybe sit around like, God of the gaps. But come on, dude. Already, try to be better than this.
In my experience, a skeptic of theism will often use this as a last resort argument.
Last resort? I've never seen any pattern of this argument being employed as a last resort. In my experience, skeptics generally point out a God of the gaps fallacy whenever they, hear Christians use a God of the gaps fallacy. So maybe I could turn the table and suggest that if atheists bring up the phrase late in conversation, it's only because Christians are the ones using the fallacy as a last resort. But these kind of accusations are anecdotal and pointless, and we're all better off analyzing our arguments instead of making juvenile preemptive attempts to characterize our opposition. But what's that? I accused this video of splitting hairs before it even started? And that was juvenile too? Fair enough. But I was pointing out a tendency within this video that I'm eventually going to back up with analysis, not just making a broad, baseless jab to characterize all Christians to my audience.
The argument tends to go like, all you have done is found something not explained by science and filled it with God. It is not a real explanation, and one day science will account for this without God, like we have done in the past with several things like lightning and earthquakes. Ancient people used to think these things were caused by gods, and present-day arguments for God's existence are exactly the same.
Wow, he actually took a break from shitting on the skeptic position long enough to more or less accurately set it up for this video. I'm a little impressed. It's sad that I have to be impressed by so little, but given what we've seen so far, I kind of am.
The problem with this line of reasoning is that it's an abuse of how the actual fallacy was supposed to be used, and it is based on a misunderstanding of history. First, the God of the Gaps fallacy was actually created by a Christian evangelist named Henry Drummond, and it was never meant to apply to metaphysical theories. The phrase was meant to be used when one inserts divine intervention into a biological process or a physical process.
Two things here. First off, I don't care who identified this fallacy or how it was originally defined. That's simply not relevant to anything, because the problem with this argument is not that it falls under a formally named category. The problem is that it's a fallacious argument, and we determine whether it's fallacious through ongoing analysis and conversation. Language is a fluid thing, So if a demonstrably poor apologetics argument can reasonably be described by the phrase God of the gaps, then Christians don't get a pass on using it just because one of their own first called dibs on the name. And second, let's keep our eye on this distinction between applying this fallacy to metaphysical theories versus biological or physical processes. I have a feeling that these are artificially distinguished categories, and that any attempt at using a metaphysical theory to prove God will be built on unexplained physical observations. But let's watch and see.
For example, we can't explain how elephants evolved from primitive mammals, therefore it was miraculous. We can't explain the order of certain orbital levels of electrons, therefore it is run by divine intervention. We can't explain how fish evolved into tetrapods, therefore divine intervention happened. However, Drummond encouraged his fellow Christians to accept all of nature as the product of God's work. In other words, the intricacies of natural processes, still unanswered by science, don't need divine intervention inserted into them. But all of nature itself still implies the existence of a creator who set natural processes into motion.
So let me get this straight. According to you, if you claim that a physical process needs to be explained by a current miracle that occurs within that process, that's God of the gaps. But if you claim that the same physical process, or the culmination of all physical processes, must be explained by God miraculously setting the universe into motion, that's not God of the gaps. Seriously? That's what you're going for? In most common usage, the God of the gaps fallacy refers to the practice of pointing to gaps in our current knowledge and saying God is needed to explain them. But the mechanism of how or when you say God did it doesn't matter. To illustrate, let's say we see a domino fall but don't know why. And one person says, "Wow, we don't know what made that domino fall. That must mean God pushed it over." But then another person says, "Well, no, I don't think God pushed that specific domino over, but he obviously must have pushed the original domino that set off the chain reaction that knocked this one over." Both of these people are doing the same thing. They're looking at a mystery and coming up with the same premature, totally unjustified explanation that God did it. The only difference is that one of them feels a little more sophisticated because he pushed that explanation a little further back in time and explained a series of natural events between the observed event and his appeal to the supernatural. But come on, we all know these are just different forms of the same thought process. Ugh. Can you see why I opened this video with an illustration about splitting hairs? Dumb asshole made me cut my finger with his stupid argument.
Inserting God into a natural process is not how most arguments for God's existence function. See, arguments for God's existence are philosophical in nature. We take scientific data and infer a philosophical or metaphysical theory that we believe best fits with the data.
In other words, God didn't push the current domino, we just looked at all the dominoes that fell and assumed he must have pushed the first one. That's what this is saying, and labeling it as metaphysical or philosophical doesn't do shit to change the fact.
For example, materialism is a metaphysical theory of reality, not a scientific theory.
I have a feeling he's going to base a lot of this video on conflating philosophical naturalism with methodological naturalism. I'm not sure how this video goes yet, at the time of writing, not recording of course, but I'm willing to bet money on it.
Materialism is the idea all that exists is matter, and the complex arrangements of matter. This cannot be proven by science, only inferred philosophically.
So what he's saying here sounds true, and in a way it might kind of be true. But his definition of materialism pushes the boundaries of language in a way that allows for certain abuses. And in fact, inspiring philosophy is going to build most of his arguments on these abuses. Now, this strategy of slipping linguistic nuance under the radar is one of apologists' favorite sleight of hand tricks. And when they try to take us off the rails like this, I think one of the easiest ways to cut through the crap and maintain clarity is with a visual aid. So here is one. Now let's say the area inside this circle represents everything we currently know. Basically what we've managed to figure out and can currently demonstrate about the physical universe, while the area outside the circle includes totally unobserved and currently unobservable things, such as the beginning of the universe, what might be outside the universe, and so on. Of course, anything we can prove to anybody else lies within the circle. And by contrast, any claim we make about what's outside the circle is totally silly because it's made up and you can't prove a word of it to anyone. Now the problem is that claims about God, including God of the gaps arguments, which pay lip service to flimsy lines of logic, are all attempts to fill in this outside circle with guesses. And since inspiring philosophy can't prove shit about his own baseless guess, he's doing the next best thing, which is to claim that materialism just makes the equally baseless guess that everything outside the circle is physical matter. Basically, well, yeah, I can't prove my thing, but you can't prove your thing either, so we're all on equal footing because everybody has to make some kind of guess. But his attempt at dragging materialism down to his level involves a subtle little trick, which is using the term materialism to cover a conflation of philosophical naturalism and methodological naturalism. See, philosophical naturalism is, roughly speaking, the idea that all that exists is natural. And to the extent that this is claimed with 100% certainty, it is making a guess about what's outside the circle. It's leagues ahead of theism in terms of the quality of the guess, but technically it still is a guess. Methodological naturalism, however, makes no guess whatsoever. Instead, it just takes the only intelligent approach to the area outside the circle, which is to say, hey, we don't know what's out there, so let's work with what we do know, which is this area in here. We'll adapt and possibly change our minds as we discover new things outside the circle, but let's get there slowly based on actual evidence. But inspiring philosophy doesn't allow this position, for good reason. Because by lumping all non-theistic stances with philosophical naturalism, and perhaps exaggerating the certainty of philosophical naturalism, inspiring philosophy is creating a false dilemma between two different ways of jumping the gun, all in a sloppy attempt to help Christians feel less silly for guessing God exists. It's a simple little trick, but he's going to get a lot of mileage out of it in ways you can probably guess.
Now, if a materialist was to argue that from something we observe in science was evidence in favor of materialism, it would be absurd for me to reply that they are just trying to explain that with the materialism of the gaps. And that is how ridiculous it sounds when a non-theist attempts to argue a God of the gaps in response to the arguments from natural theology or the metaphysical theory of theism.
Absolutely not. The very idea of materialism of the gaps is just nonsense. And already we see inspiring philosophy rush to cash in on his previous efforts to confuse materialism and philosophical naturalism. God of the gaps arguments are problematic because, when faced with a mystery about how the universe works, they jump the gun and import purely guessed-at information from out here. But materialism never does any such thing. He wants us to think not only that materialism assumes everything outside our realm of observation is physical, but that it draws on this assumption to explain things it can't within the universe, like theists do when they import assumptions about God. But this is silly. First off, because even philosophical naturalism just assumes everything operates by the same rules as the natural universe, an assumption that provides no supernatural nonsense to fill gaps with anyway, and just encourages actual scientific inquiry. And second, remember that this is a moot point anyway, because methodological naturalism does not make assumptions about anything outside the universe. Inspiring philosophy is basically just dipping into an age-old attempt to equate not importing assumptions about God with importing assumptions that there is no God.
Theists are not actually arguing from a gap in a natural process, but arguing for a metaphysical theory of reality, which attempts to explain why there are natural processes, or what is the best way to explain reality. Metaphysical theories attempt to explain all of reality and what reality is. When a theist argues God exists from arguments used in natural theology, one is not arguing from a gap in our knowledge with regards to how natural processes work, but arguing a whole scientific process or certain data infers a theistic worldview. That is by definition not arguing from a gap, but arguing our full understanding of science infers a theistic worldview.
We've already been over this. Basically, he's just saying God pushed a domino way up the chain instead of a domino we're looking at, and then claims this makes him less superstitious. A picture of a tipped-over cup filled with stars doesn't make this more impressive.
For example, cosmological arguments do not argue for a gap in the evolution of the universe, but they argue the universe, as a whole, has a necessary and sentient cause.
In other words, there are current gaps in our knowledge that can only be explained by God at the beginning of the universe. But this isn't God of the gaps.
Teleological arguments do not argue from gaps within physical processes, but argues the fine-tuning of the universe, as a whole, leads to design.
In other words, there are current gaps in our understanding of why the universe is apparently fine-tuned that can only be explained by God tuning it. But of course, this isn't God of the gaps.
Saying these and other similar arguments, or arguing from gaps, would be as absurd as saying the theory of gravity is a gap filler until we find a better explanation. The theory of gravity, which almost everyone accepts, is the best way to explain certain observable phenomena. We have observed data in physical reality and came up with a theory of gravity to best explain this data. It would be absurd for someone, like a flat earther, to say gravity is just a gap filler, and that we can't explain why objects fall to the earth, so we have just inserted our made-up theory of gravity into this process. A logical person would just respond that gravity is simply the best explanation of observable data. If one day we find a better explanation, then it will replace gravity, but currently it is not just a gap filler. And when theists argue that all of reality is best explained by theism, we are not arguing from a gap in our knowledge with regards to physical or biological processes. We are arguing like one argues from the evidence for the theory of gravity.
Okay, do I really need to explain this to you? Do I need to explain that the theory of gravity is not an unobserved thing comprised of random traits that people just made up? Do I need to explain that it's a parsimonious model for summing up phenomena we've actually observed, and does not rely on importing any random guesses about what lies outside the universe? That it's subject to constant revision as we make new observations? To strike a contrast, do I need to catalog all the assumptions about God that theists simply make up based on sheer guesses about the existence and nature of a being nobody's ever seen? Do I need to point out that this being was not observed, as gravity is, was not studied, as gravity is, cannot be repeatedly demonstrated, as gravity is? Do I need to explain that if scientists invoke gravity the way theistic philosophers invoke God, then upon seeing things fall, they'd forgo rigorous scientific investigation and just say, well, obviously the gravity monster loves us and doesn't want us to fly up into space, so it gently holds us on the ground to protect us. And by the way, the gravity monster happens to be what I learned about in Sunday school. I hope not, because I already spent way too long asking rhetorical questions about this, and I'm tired of talking about it now. If you don't get the difference between a tentative but solid theory built on observations and using the supernatural to explain things that mystify you, you're probably trying to be obtuse.
Also, we should note science is not burying theism. The best arguments for God's existence have come about from modern advancements in science from within the past 100 years.
So basically, people have made more sophisticated arguments for God as our population became more educated and religion had to contend with more complex scientific realities. This is exactly what we would expect in a godless universe. But if God existed, I wonder why he would have let all these arguments sit dormant for thousands of years while unconvinced people went to hell for lack of access to them.
So the current arguments for God's existence don't compare to ancient beliefs in natural gods that cause lightning or earthquakes. The more science reveals, the more evidence we have for God's existence, as I've argued in past videos. When non-theists try to use the God of the Gaps argument in response to natural theology, in reality, they only shoot themselves in the foot. First, saying evidence which implies theism will be overturned by people in the future is nothing more than arguing a future humans of the gaps argument. One is essentially saying, I don't know the answer to this, but I know more intelligent people in the future will have an answer, and I know it will fit my worldview of non-theism. Instead of offering a better explanation of the data to counter theism, one has filled a gap in their worldview with the unknown knowledge of future humans. You don't know what the future will bring, so you just can't assume more intelligent individuals in the future will find an explanation that is better than a theistic one. This is just an attempt to ignore a clear problem for a non-theistic worldview and hoping and believing it will one day go away.
Non-theists don't depend on future people filling gaps in our knowledge, and the fact that you think we do betrays a weakness in your own thinking. You have an ancient superstitious discomfort with the idea of unanswered questions. You think they need to be answered by something, that there's something inherently unresolved, even unnatural, with us not having answers. And this weakness is so foundational to your approach to the world that you think everybody, including us, must share it with you. Thus you think that if we don't have God to answer our questions, we must be holding oh so desperately onto a hope that future humans will. But the difference between us and you is not that we find a different way to fill all these gaps, and it's not that we need future humans to possess this knowledge the way you need God to possess it. The difference is that we're perfectly comfortable with unanswered questions. We don't hope they'll go away, as you say, because we don't need them to. We think they're part of life, and many of us, me included, think there will be many questions humans will just never answer. So we let our I don't knows be I don't knows and study actual things we can learn instead of jumping to unfounded conclusions. The fact that you don't seem to recognize this about us leads me to wonder whether you're more confused than manipulative.
One does not really provide an answer, but just assumes their worldview is already correct, on blind faith, and places their faith in future humans to confirm what they want to be true. Second, notice what they have admitted without realizing it. They have not explained how materialism, or other non-theistic views, can account for these pieces of data, but admitted these are gaps in the materialist or naturalistic view of reality. Non-theistic views cannot fully explain the data the theists have offered, and they only hope it will be explained in the future. So in saying these arguments are God of the gaps arguments, they simply assume the worldview and inadvertently admit these are gaps in their philosophical view of reality that their non-theistic theory of reality cannot account for.
So here he's making 2 points. First, he's once more accusing us of assuming our worldview, which again just stems from his failure to distinguish between philosophical and methodological naturalism. And second, he's, well, basically accusing us of not jumping to conclusions. Guilty as charged, I guess.
Thus, in reality, they admit theism is the better explanation of reality if they cannot account for this data through a materialistic worldview, or offer a better and more parsimonious explanation.
And here he continues to berate us for not jumping to conclusions and boasts in the fact that he does.
Thus, when a non-theist cries God of the gaps, they are not really addressing any arguments for God's existence, but admitting to us all they are just assuming their worldview that God doesn't exist, and any evidence for God could not possibly mean that God exists.
No, the problem is that there's no evidence for God, which is why your best attempts at proving his existence rely on telling us that he automatically and for unobserved reasons explains unsolved mysteries.
So it must just be a gap until someone comes along and solves this issue for their worldview.
Again, we have no issue for our worldview because we operate in here instead of making assumptions about anything out here.
All they do is admit their view of reality cannot explain as much as theism can.
It explains a lot more than theism does because it actually explains anything. Theism just says, oh cool, to the stuff science has actually explained, then congratulates itself for making unfounded assumptions about everything else.
And there are clear gaps they cannot account for within their framework.
Yes, I've noticed it too. He's already shown this exact same graphic before, which gives us the chance to notice that the left column says, can explain for everything, while the right column says, do not know. This is an interesting trick of wording, and it leads you to wonder, why is he comparing what theists can explain to what non-theists actually know? Is this a tacit admission that theists don't know anything they claim? And that non-theists could explain all these things if they were equally content just to make it up? Seriously, it's like there were 2 guys exploring a cave. One of them takes a flashlight and slowly, methodically walks around while mapping out what he sees. But the other just sits where he is and randomly draws caverns and passages, then brags because his map has more information than his friends.
So in reality, crying God of the gaps in response to natural theology only creates more problems for the non-theist than it solves.
Or so it would appear if you don't understand the concepts of methodological naturalism, the God of the gaps fallacy, the scientific method, or anything else. Oh, and if you have your head shoved so far up the ass of your own religion that you can't pull it back out. I'm not sure why this guy calls himself inspiring philosophy. Philosophy is supposed to be the love of wisdom, not this.